I don't know when I first began to build the wall. I suppose it was when it occurred to me that I could keep people out of my life by building a simple wall. The wall would be a kind of boundary, a kind of protection. At first, little wall was only knee high. It was really quite attractive, made of native stones I had found in my life. The wall was so small that some people didn't notice it, and I would stumble right over it and fall flat on their faces. Others saw my wall, it, but they would step over it and come very close to me. I found this very uncomfortable. So I built a higher wall. The higher wall was really much better, but I found that some people would come and rest their arms on the wall while they talked to me. Some stayed too long, and some were not my kind of people. And even when I edged the top of the wall with sharp stones, they didn't even seem to notice. One day, one of them vaulted over the wall and stood right inside. This really made me angry, so I decided to build the wall higher. As I continued to build, I became more and more self-sufficient, and soon no one could see in or out. But then I realized that no one had stopped to talk to me for some time. Some people, by not seeming to notice me or my wall. Others stood sadly by and watched me build. I thought, they're really jealous of my wall, and I resented them, all of them. Some of my stones were so dear to me that I polished them carefully several times a day. Then one day I realized the wall was so high that I no longer saw or heard anybody go by. "Is anyone there?" I yelled. There was no answer. It was dark and the air smelled bad. I stayed there for a long time. It was quiet and dark and lonely. Only the whisper of my memories could be heard. One day someone yelled from the other side, "Your wall is ugly. It is twisted and grey and all out of shape." Now I didn't want to hear this. I liked my wall. In fact, some of the stones from which I had built it were very dear to me. It was the day the flower fell at my feet that I began to cry. I ran to the wall and climbed to see who had thrown the flower over the wall. By the time I reached the top of the wall, no one was there. I returned to the flower and sat for a long time looking at its perfection. I began to see the folly of my wall and its imperfection. Floods of tears brought me to my knees. Oh, I am so alone. My wall is too high and too thick and too ugly. I have nothing left. Won't somebody help me, please? Then a strange thing happened. Something inside of me stirred like a remembrance of peaceful times past. And in the stillness of my broken world, I knew God was there. A blessed presence, that God would come to me, that my darkness had been penetrated by this blessed light. I stood in the joy of this presence. I knew that God had watched me build my wall, and that God had waited patiently for me to see it was really a selfish waste of time. Finally, it occurred to me that the divine creator could tell me why my wall was so ugly. It was when I began to ask that God then began to teach me. God gave the stones names. This stone is jealousy. You must remove it. Sometimes I would protest. This was one of my favorite stones. It was one I had saved and cherished for years. But when I was finally ready, God helped me remove that stone. And so it went through stones named envy, stones named disillusionment, another stone resentment, another stone childishness, another stone stubbornness, sometimes with God's help, sometimes with the help of strangers. As we removed more stones, the light began to come in. I even felt a hand reaching through a small hole trying to touch me. Then there was a stranger who walked in one day and told me he had let God tear down his wall, and told him how I had suffered so, and that I would never forget how forsaken and lonely I had felt inside my wall. Yes, he said, self-pity is a terrible thing. When he left, I found my stone of self-pity in my wall. And what do you know? It was wet with my tears. I dried it off and laid it with the other stones I had taken from the wall, overwhelmed by all God had done for me and all God had taught me. I stood on a large remaining stone and began to tell anyone who passed by what God had done for me. I was appalled that no one seemed to hear what I was saying. I noticed others working on their walls and ran over to plead with them to stop, but nobody would listen. In my frustration, I lay face down on the stone I had stood upon. It was extremely large and highly polished. It was more than life-size. Do you want the answer to your question? God asked. Raise your head and look at the stone you are lying upon. I raised my head and caught my breath, for I saw my own reflection in the massive stone. Suddenly I knew the stone's name, Pride. Quietly, we removed it. Then God said a strange thing. Now you must go. I will go with you, and yet I will stay here. I protested. There are still more stones to remove. I want you here. I said I would go with you. Do you remember the flower that fell at your feet? Said the Lord. The hand that came through the hole to touch you? The stranger who showed you your own self-pity? Oh, yes, I thought to myself. Oh, yes. Then you must go and do likewise. For to whom much grace is given, much grace is expected. Wherever you go, I'll go with you. And whenever you come back here to be tempted or to remove more stones, I'll be here for you. And so I went out. I saw the walls of others, and when I could, I threw a flower over and reached my hand through the hole. Those walls were unbelievably ugly. I heard great sobs behind the walls, and my heart ached. I even cried out to God one day, won't you please help this person? Later, I returned to my wall, and God, the blessed presence, was there. Together we removed the stones of fear, mistrust, and the stone of indifference. Then God said, now you're beginning to understand love. Without love, the things I have told you would be meaningless. You will begin to live in peace, understanding of all those people around you whom you thought were not your kind. So it was. I went forth, reaching out, sometimes just waiting beside somebody's wall, sometimes tossing a flower, and sometimes grabbing a hand through a hole in their wall. Wow. Thank you, Father God, that we can take a few minutes to bow our head in silence and meditate on all the stones that are in my life, to meditate on all these terrible things that are keeping me back from loving my neighbor as I love myself. Take me out of my prison chains, I pray, and take away all these stones in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.